Welcome! What is planning poker? Planning poker is a game used to estimate how much complexity and risk is involved in the delivery of a feature. The game doesn't actually produce a plan, and the name is trademarked, so we prefer to use the name estimation poker. In the past, it has also been called pointing poker and Scrum Poker. In this video, we'll briefly discuss how work is managed in Agile teams and the role of the game in producing plans and forecasts using story points. In the game, players use cards to assign an estimate to a user story. The card chosen indicates a number of story points, a relative unit of complexity. So what are user stories? A user story is an informal, natural language description of features of a software system. They are written from the perspective of a user of a system and may be recorded on index cards, post-it notes, or digitally. In other words, these things. You may remember seeing these on a wall near to your on-site team of programmers, or on a computer screen in a similar format. These cards symbolize an ongoing conversation between technical and other stakeholders about a particular product feature. There is a little bit of detail on the card about the feature so that you know you share an understanding of which feature is described on the card. Sometimes, perhaps on the back of the card, there will be a list of acceptance criteria so that everyone knows whether the feature is acceptable as complete or if it is not yet complete. User stories are prioritized in a backlog. A backlog is a sequence of work items in priority order. There are two basic kinds. The product backlog is a collection of all user stories in priority order. Your product owner decides the correct order of user stories based on all available information. The sprint backlog is the work required to achieve a sprint goal. It sometimes includes items that are not user stories, but which otherwise contribute to the goals of the sprint. This backlog is owned by a delivery team because it is the work they are collaborating to deliver right now. Estimation poker helps you by letting you forecast when a delivery team will deliver a certain user story. In particular, teams will want to decide if that date falls within the sprint or whether the sprint goal is too large for the sprint duration. Of course, not all Agile teams work in sprints. In this video, we'll assume you are merely trying to forecast some sort of milestone, whether that fits within one sprint or whether that's a much longer program of work. In estimation poker, you estimate stories using story points. Story points are essentially units of complexity. If there is a risk something might go wrong, we encourage team members to use a higher complexity rating. So the estimate folds together complexity and risk. One assumes something is bound to go wrong. Story points are not a measure of time. We translate them to time using an empirical process that I will describe later. We don't generally count steps, tasks, lines of code, logical branches, or anything else. We do base estimates on a shared understanding of what work the feature requires, and part of the gameplay involves checking that the team has a shared understanding. The numbers mean exactly nothing. This is because complexity is, well, complex. Instead, we focus our attention on relative complexity. Imagine a really simple bit of carpentry, putting a nail in the wall of your garden shed to hang up a tool. You hit it with a hammer, and you're done. 1 point. Hanging a picture in your living room is more complex. You drill the hole, add a plastic plug, screw in a hook. The plaster can break, and the hole can be too small or too big. Maybe 2 or 3 points. Hanging a curtain rail is similar, but you need to measure distances, keep things level, and ensure there is enough strength, at least 5 points. If you have a concrete lintel, 13 points. Of course, not everyone is doing DIY. You're probably doing something much more sophisticated. So points will mean something different in your working context, and that will even vary from one team to another, depending on what kind of work it is that they are doing. Now we know what context players are working in when they play the game. Let's focus on the rules of the game. The first step is for the product owner to explain a user story. Who needs the feature? What do they want to occur and when? Why do they want it? What outcome is the user and the business trying to achieve? Players will usually discuss how the feature might be delivered and might write down some of the major tasks needed to deliver it. Once players feel they have a shared understanding of what it takes to deliver the feature, it is time to estimate. They do this by selecting a card that reflects their impression of the story. The selection is anchored by a few points of objective information. The simplest imaginable user story is always worth 1 point. Also, from the second estimated story onwards, which means after no more than 30 minutes, players will be able to recall what points they gave to other stories and can choose a number relative to those stories. The relationship between these estimates of complexity and units of time comes later. Notice that time is not used during the game at all. Once the players have chosen a number, they count to 3 and reveal their scores. Once players reveal their chosen scores, they must decide which score to carry forward as the team's estimate for the complexity of this user story. If there is consensus, then players simply take that value. If there are 2 values and they are not distant from each other, then it is common to choose the higher value and move on quickly. When there are players with scores that diverge, then the players at the extremes need to have a further conversation. Usually, there is something bothering one of the players, and perhaps one of the players knows some information that will help deliver the story more easily, or some information that means it will be harder to deliver. It will usually be obvious, based on an exchange of information, which player is right. If it isn't, then repeat the process a few more times until one of the other rules, such as choosing the higher card, can be used to resolve the situation. So, how do meaningless points turn into a plan? The first step is to return to your backlog and ensure it is in a sensible order, taking into account dependencies and the value of the stories to the business. Usually, a specific story unlocks the value of a set of stories or enables a deliverable outside technology to go ahead. The classic example is planning TV advertising around the launch of a new feature. You need to know when the feature will be ready to make a plan for the rest of the business. The last story in a set of stories is said to define a milestone. The estimation poker game gives you one estimate for one story per round. Play several rounds and you will have estimates for all user stories measured in story points, which means you now know how many points are required to deliver the milestone. The next step is to get some statistics. Established teams will be able to look back at previous work or prior sprints. New teams will have to operate on guesswork for a short while. This is usually not a problem. Once you have some data, you can calculate your velocity, points per day, or usually points per week or per sprint. If these 2 stories, for example, consumed your entire sprint, then your sprint velocity would be 8 points. As long as your sprints are the same length, then you can continue to work in points per sprint, even if you have a long sprint duration. If you don't use sprints, then focus on the duration of the story, starting from when the work began. In this simple example, the developers managed 8 points in 10 days, which works out at 4 points per work week. This is smaller than a normal team velocity because our example has to fit on one slide. However, it's not technically possible to compare velocities. Do be careful of that. The next step is simply to add up the points required to get what you want. In this case, the milestone is achieved after 21 points. Now, simply divide the total by the velocity and you will know when the milestone is going to be delivered. In this case, 5 1/4 weeks on paper. Personally, I would round it up to 6 because developers will tend to deliver on the Friday. You must also factor in other issues like sickness and holidays, especially if your project runs over the summer or over Christmas. If you have a bit more data, you can make more nuanced claims. For instance, if you take the effective velocity of individual stories, which is duration divided by points, and take the 95th percentile, then you arrive at a more pessimistic velocity. However, you can then say you are 95% confident in your delivery before a date. And that's it. If you have any questions or anything is not clear, feel free to reach out to Agile Stationery. If we don't know the answer ourselves, we can put you in contact with a range of experts from the Agile industry. To get started, you'll need a pack of estimation poker cards. Due to the change in circumstances, we are now selling individual packs known as Virtual Agile Ritual cards. And we sell 2 team packs, estimation poker cards and Scrum Poker cards, which are optimized for teams that split stories and have a strict definition of ready. When you are ready, head to agilestationery.com to get yours.